Hello and welcome to Shattered Lives, Reach Ireland's crime podcast. My name is Paul Healy and I'm joined as always by Michael O'Toole. How's it going, Michael?
Hi, Paul. I'm a wee bit tired. I was up watching the debate last night. Thought it was very interesting. Quite a few points in it. But this is a crime podcast, so we won't get into that. But
No.
I thought it was interesting to watch, and I think I'll just say this very quickly. I thought she was slightly hesitant, but she was obviously better prepared, and he came up with some batshit crazy things. But I do think he finished very strongly. They have a minute each at the end. I thought his
Mm,
last speech was very good.
mm. Well, I will say if people really are eating cats and dogs, maybe there's a crime in that. Maybe that's something we actually can discuss. But yeah, look, let's not get into politics here.
No,
That's not our
no,
forte.
no.
But it's fascinating to watch. Um, yeah, look, I suppose the big crime story of the day that we want to discuss, and again, it's the death of a key Kinahan cartel member and Byrne organized crime group member. That is Liam. Liam Rowe was last week, but now we're discussing the death of James Jaws Byrne. So it's been a very tough time for the Byrne family and the
Mm.
Byrne organized crime group because obviously the death of Liam Rowe kind of came out of the blue. He had a short illness and he passed away. In the interim, we knew that Jaws Byrne, as he is called, had been in Tala Hospital for a number of days and had been quite ill. He was in his late 70s, and he is the father of Liam Byrne and of David Byrne. David Byrne, who was murdered, shot dead in the Regency Hotel on the 5th of February 2016, and that murder obviously was central to the Kinahan Hutch feud. So the death of Jaws Byrne is significant, and it comes at a very difficult time for the Byrne family, doesn't it?
Yeah. So as you said, Liam Byrne and David were two of his sons. He has another son called James. So he was James, but he was known as Jemmy or Jaws Byrne. Very well known. I think it's fair to say he was a veteran criminal involved
Mm,
in the 80s and 90s, but he was a father as well. So, I mean, the family are suffering. But we have to say what we know. We did know he'd been sick at the. It struck me. We knew that he'd been in hospital in Tala around the
yeah.
time Liam Rowe died, and then we know, for example, that Sadie Byrne, his wife, attended the funeral of Liam Rowe. He didn't, so I sort of took that as an indication that he was
Hmm.
quite. But we knew that he was bad. But I thought that was
Mm,
quite an indication that he was quite seriously ill. So then he passed away. Obviously the family are suffering, but we do have to talk about this man's background and the wider uh, context, I suppose, on this really. So David, his son, was murdered in the Regency. Um, it always struck me the one thing about that murder, which probably we don't talk about, is he initially, and I wrote about this the other day. He initially escaped the Regency when the Hutch organised crime gang tried to murder Daniel Kinnan. David Byrne was there, as was Liam, and David Byrne got out
yeah.
and he escaped. But people may have seen the video, the CCTV, he ran back in. That was
Mm,
probably to see if he could help Liam. You would think, would it?
yeah. That was the thinking, and I can even recall one of his sisters actually telling me that David ran back in to look for Liam, to look for his brother, and that is when he was shot in the lobby there.
By one of the TAC 2, TAC 3 men dressed as Garda, the ERU team.
Yes, yes,
So,
yeah,
his other son, I mentioned there's another son called James, but his other son, Liam, is in England, and he is about to go on trial facing quite serious charges.
yeah. As we mentioned on last week's podcast, and we will be covering this trial in detail as it opens. But Liam Byrne is on trial for firearms and conspiracy charges. So look, we're limited in terms of what we can say as regards that, but that's an 8 week trial, up to an 8 week trial, and Liam Byrne goes on trial next week. So the timing of this for the Byrne family is obviously quite difficult. I mean, they've lost Liam Rowe, who was a cousin of Liam and David Byrne, a nephew of Sadie and James Byrne, and now James has passed away. As we said, known as Jaws Byrne. I kind of just want to, and obviously give you time to speak about this as well, because you're maybe more rehearsed in the history of Jaws Byrne before he came on my radar. But I suppose he was very much, out of the picture in terms of criminality. He was a veteran figure, someone who was obviously involved in crime at a younger age. That was passed on to the next generation, and obviously the next generation are another story entirely. But Jaws Byrne, I suppose the significance of him in more recent times, if there's anything I suppose to speak about in terms of crime, it is his involvement or I suppose knowledge of the events that led to the many murders in the Kinahan Hutch feud, and specifically the murders that happened after David Byrne was killed in the Regency, because it became a different sort of a feud and a much more personal and violent feud after the death of David Byrne, because those closest to David Byrne wanted revenge and they wanted it quickly. It was one thing to target Daniel Kinahan, which was obviously a huge thing to do, and there had to be retribution for that. But those closest to David Byrne, they wanted revenge and they wanted it quickly. What we can now reveal, and what we said during the week in the Star, is that Jaws Byrne was central to that initial plot that was hatched in the hours after his son was murdered. There were those who were extremely angry. They took this very personally and they wanted revenge. And we know that there are people that were very close to Jaws Byrne who said that they wanted anyone associated with the Hutch family, the Hutch organization, killed, murdered. And that then Kinahan cartel associates took that word and went on and carried out a plot to murder several Hutch associates. And we know that Eddie Hutch, a brother of Jerry the Monk Hutch, was murdered only 3 days after that. But the key thing that Jaws was involved in here is that he was in the room, so to speak, when that plot was hatched. And I suppose ultimately sanctioned it, because he stood by when that decision was made to go after and target anyone associated with the Hutch organization.
And he was very much a driver. So it wasn't just encouraging. I think he was proactively, he and others who were close to David Byrne were driving this wave of revenge. And I think that it was, I mean, looking back, it really was unprecedented at the time. It just seemed, do you remember? So the Regency happened on a Friday. If you remember that, obviously you'd remember the 5th of February. On the 8th, Eddie Hutch was killed. But see, from then, I actually remember that day going on radio and saying, look, this is going to get really bad. I didn't think it would get so bad and so strong really, really quickly. And it did, just for 5 or 6 months from February 2016. It really was like being in the center of a war. Now, I use that term advisedly, and there's a couple of points. I can't say who it is, but the guards stopped someone very central to the Kinahan and the Byrne organised crime gang shortly after the Regency. And he basically, I think they were trying to reason with them. And guards do this. It's not, they do interact with criminals and they do talk to criminals and try and see. I do know that, for example, that on the other side, they did try to speak to somebody who would be very senior in the Hutch gang. And they tried to, can we stop this before it explodes?
Yeah.
And so the person on the Hutch said, no, not a chance. But the fella on the Kinahan side said, no, this is war. This is going to be really, really heavy war. And he was right. And it really exploded. And I think it's fair to say that people associated very closely with David Byrne, including Jaws Byrne, wanted that revenge because they took it personal. And I think you make a very interesting point. They wanted anybody on that side, but anybody that they perceived on that side. So if you were a Hutch, there's the Hutch organised crime gang, but there's the Hutch extended family. And if you were a Hutch, you were in serious trouble. You were in serious bother, because they were coming after anybody tangentially even linked to the Hutch family, never mind the Hutch crime gang.
Yeah. Look, I mean, and they took personal issue with they particularly wanted the likes of Patsy Hutch, Patrick Hutch Jr., and Jerry Hutch murdered. And they went after anyone even, they considered to be close to them as well. Eddie Hutch was in many ways a soft target. He was a taxi driver. Okay, there was a perception and a belief that perhaps he might have been one of the drivers, that was never proven, but that he might have been one of the drivers in the Regency incident.
But this just goes back to the point we made last week about Di Douglas and Darren Kearns. Gangsters, mobs like the Kinahan cartel and the Hutch organised crime gang, they don't operate on a level of proof. They operate on a level of suspicion. So if they think X was involved, then they are going to try and do everything they can to kill X. It's not a court. There's no DPP for criminality. It's we want him dead or we want her dead. And even, I can think of like Sean McGovern, we know that the guards want him for a murder, but there was another murder and he was in the area scoping out people the day before, trying to get involved in this. So, and obviously McGovern was very close to David Byrne and the Byrne family and the Byrne crime group. And he was central to this revenge plot, but that just goes to show you how serious it was and what a major threat it was for the Garda and for the Hutch extended family at the time. It was really, looking back, it was really, really acute and really, really dangerous.
Yeah, I'm just thinking as you're making those points, sometimes we get criticized for continually talking about the feud and going back to the Regency incident, but with each new development that happens, we can further contextualize things and give you more information. And I think what's an important point to make here, with the death of Jaws Byrne, we can now tell you about something that really wasn't in the public domain, which was that this deeply personal revenge plot was hatched, and that he was party to that. And so it shows you that, oftentimes we focus on Daniel Kinahan, and it was the plot to kill Daniel Kinahan that sparked the revenge murders. And obviously Gary Hutch was the murder that started the whole feud. It's a Hutch-Kinahan feud, but people forget about the Byrne element of it. And really, when David Byrne was murdered, people very, very close to him would not let that go. And that is what took it to the extra level, because that deep anger and hatred led to just all reason was off the table, and they literally just were gunning for revenge for that moment. And Jaws Byrne was party to that.
Let me ask you a question, Paul. So we know that Sean McGovern was shot in the Regency. He didn't cooperate with Garda. I know what I think. What do you think? Do you think the feud would have been as bad if Sean McGovern had been killed and David Byrne survived?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either, because, people like Jaws Byrne wanted this revenge. It was
bloodthirst in them.
It was bloodthirst, yeah. They understandably, from their perspective, they took this really personally, and I used the word driver earlier, and I think that is a very good analogy. He and others were driving this onslaught of revenge by the Kinahan crime gang.
Yeah. Now, the feud evolved, but those initial murders and the people that were targeted because they believed that they were involved in the Regency incident, because it all sparked back to that attempt on Daniel Kinahan, but obviously the murder of David Byrne. So that it took it to another level. I just want to talk a bit about Jaws Byrne's background prior to all of this, because obviously he is in his own right a criminal, a veteran criminal. He had a significant amount of wealth, didn't he? And he had a mortgage-free home there in Raleigh Square, and in and of itself, he had dealings with the Criminal Assets Bureau in the past.
Well, this is significant because I was talking to somebody about this today. I think it was the early noughties, 2002, maybe 2003, and he was hit with a tax demand by the Criminal Assets Bureau. So what effectively what the Criminal Assets Bureau does, it taxes proceeds of crime, or what they allege are proceeds of crime. So it taxes criminality. So if they can't get them in the criminal courts, the guards and the Criminal Assets Bureau, they'll go after their wealth. So they hit him with a tax demand. It was well over 300, I think it was about 370,000 euro.
378,000 euro, yeah.
Yes. So he settled that, and it wasn't half. It was, you probably got the figure there, it was 250,000 something, was it?
It was 208,400.
Right. Okay. So that's a significant amount of money. But I was just talking to somebody about this. He must have been one of the first targets of the Criminal Assets Bureau, because it was set up after the murder of Veronica Guerin in June 1996. And you'd know, Paul, from covering the Criminal Assets Bureau, when there are orders or whether there are tax demands, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a very long investigation, has to go to the court. So it's 4 or 5 years. So I think it's fair to say he would have been one of the first people
Mm.
investigated by the Criminal Assets Bureau. So what was he involved in? He was involved in counterfeit and fraud, blank
Yeah, he was
checks, that sort of
blank
thing.
blank checks. He got a 4 year prison sentence for that. Sorry, a 3 year sentence for
3 years.
forging blank checks that had been stolen from offices and during an armed robbery as well.
And it's interesting. He was on trial for 5 days for several other charges, but after the 5 days, he pleaded guilty to this charge, and the other charges were discontinued. But yeah, I mean, I was just reading the old copy, 1995, before I started in journalism, but it was described as an Aladdin's cave. Now, the court did hear that he was there was loads of checks stolen and stuff in robberies and burglaries. The court, it was John O'Mahony was the detective sergeant who was later Assistant Commissioner John O'Mahony. So it just goes to show the career trajectory. But they did hear that the court did hear that he wasn't involved in the robberies per se, but he was involved in the after effects. In other words, using the checks, selling the checks, or whatever. Wee bit like Christy Kinnan. If you remember, Christy Kinnan was involved in check fraud before he was sort of parallel to his drug deal in the 80s. So maybe it was, we don't know, maybe because we're of an era where it's all cards and stuff. But there were, I think, back in the day, criminals could make serious money from blank checks and all that sort of stuff. So obviously, but if he pays over €200,000 and is hit with €370,000, that would be an indicator that the guards and the revenue commissioners believed that he was making much more than that, because you're effectively taxed on it. So, they would believe that maybe he had £1,000,000 and they earned £1,000,000 and they taxed him that much, or 30 or 40%, So that is quite significant.
He was obviously clearly very involved in criminality, and the fact that he hadn't had any meaningful employment in over 50 years, and yet he had that kind of wealth, it just tells you what he was really up to.
But interestingly, in the last couple of years, 2016, when the Criminal Assets Bureau went after people, the younger generation, shall we say, there was evidence given that really he wasn't involved in that side of it anymore, and he was reliant on others involved in criminality to effectively give him money. But it just goes to show you that, he was very involved in the day, and then he took a back seat, and he was in his late 60s and early 70s. So, I suppose he can't be. But yeah, he was relying on others later on in life.
Yeah, the High Court ruling in 2018 says that that James Byrne, along with his wife Sadie, daughter Maria, and three others, who I'm not going to name here, it says, while not members of the Byrne organised crime group, are closely related to its members and involved in money laundering. They also have access to the proceeds of criminal activity carried out by the Byrne organised crime group.
So the Byrne organised crime group was bankrolling them, basically.
Yes, effectively.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he was an interesting character. I met him once. I was in the room with him a lot during the Regency trial of Jerry Hutch. He did come to the trial a lot, and he also went to the trial of Patrick Hutch Jr. But it was the trial of Patrick Hutch Jr. who was accused of the murder of David Byrne in the Regency Hotel that I actually spoke to James Jaws Byrne in 2019. So that trial collapsed infamously. There was a null prosequi entered, and Patrick Hutch Jr. walked free after the death of the lead detective superintendent, Colin Fox, at the time. But the Byrne family were absolutely outraged over that, and they launched a protest outside the court building, and they ultimately went up to the Dáil. And I went up to the Dáil and I spoke to them there as a family, and Jaws Byrne actually spoke to me directly, and he was probably among the more I suppose level-headed at that point in time. A lot of them were very angry and shouting, and I said, well, look, I'm here to talk to you. If you want to talk to me, I'll hear your side of things. But he basically said that their gripe was with the Gardaí and with the media, the typical sort of thing, and with the fact that Patsy Hutch in particular, they signalled out singled out Patsy Hutch, the father of Patrick Hutch Jr. They were giving out about the fact that Jaws Byrne gave out about the fact that Patsy had 24-hour protection, and yet no one else did. And he said, is no one else in danger? Like, why is he the only one getting 24-hour protection? And I can distinctly remember they were even holding up a poster with Patsy's face on it. So they very much blamed him for what happened to their son. We now know in the background, they wanted him dead, and they were, it's kind of ironic and funny that he was out on the record saying, how he was incandescent. He was annoyed that this person's getting 24-hour protection, whereas the people around him were just simply trying to whack him.
But I mean, to fact check, there were other people getting Garda protection. We know that there was a post, as the guards would call it, a protection post or a community reassurance post for Johnny, the now deceased brother. And there were 4 or 5 others. We know that there were guards at Jerry Hutch's house. There were checkpoints there all the time. Patsy was a target, and I think that's why the guards had to protect him. But there were several community reassurance beats in the North Inner City, principally because the Kinahan organised crime gang and the Byrne organised crime gang were trying to kill people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he had full knowledge of that. I just remember, I remember being struck about just how much moaning they were doing, and how it was just poor us, in spite of the fact that they had full knowledge that they were that the Kinahan cartel were going after people, and they were the drivers of the feud. But Jaws Byrne in particular had taken real issue with being associated with the Kinahan cartel. And I remember him saying to me, we're not Kinahans, we're Byrnes, and very much wanted to make that distinction that we're not the Kinahan cartel, we're the Byrnes. And even in hindsight, I'm thinking about the fact that he wanted to make that distinction.
Do you think that he was proud of that sort of Byrne organized crime moniker?
I think so. Yeah, I got that impression. I mean, they're very much the guys on the ground in Dublin. Liam, the Byrne organised crime group, effectively ran things in Dublin, and they were the front of the cartel, so to speak. And I even reading between the lines of what Jaws said to me, I think, he was trying to make a distinction of, we the Kinahans are one thing, we're another thing.
It took me a while to get my head around that, I'll be honest.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't know about you, because it was like, oh, okay, one gang. So the way I sort of rationalized it was that it was almost like a franchise. So there were a subset, but they were centrally involved with the Kinahan cartel as well, but they had their own organized crime. And because I remember guards would say to me, really, look, it's the Byrne organized crime gang, really. And they have this attachment and overlapping relationship with the Kinahan cartel, which is a huge, as we know, worldwide cartel. But on the ground in Crumlin, in the Liberties, it was the Byrne organized crime group.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me a while to report, as a reporter, to.
Same here, yeah, because and I suppose we looped them in as all being Kinahans. Look, there's no doubt about it. They benefited from being in league with the Kinahan cartel, and that's where the money came from. But I think they were very proud of the fact that they were the guys on the ground and they were the ones slumming it, so to speak. I mean, they didn't have the immense cartel wealth that Daniel and Christy Kinahan have, and that they weren't able to flee to Dubai and live that kind of lavish life of luxury. They still, although they had plenty of money, lived in the Crumlin area of Dublin and behaved and acted like they were working class citizens. James Byrne, Jaws Byrne, he also said to me, we're not innocent people. He said, I just have the quote in front of me, I'm not saying we've never done anything, but we are not a crime gang, he said. So, I think it has been thoroughly debunked that he and others around him were not involved in any crime gang. Clearly they were, and that's where that money came from. How else do you explain it?
And people can draw their own conclusions from that. Mr. Byrne is entitled to say that, but I think there's evidence to
the contradict.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think that's fair.
Yeah. Well, look at he's passed away now. His funeral is this Friday. I understand it's going to be a fairly low key Garda presence. I mean, that's not to say they won't be watching it, and that's not to say that they're not monitoring any potential threats. But I bring this up only because, again, it shows we're in a different place in terms of the Kinahan Hutch feud. These funerals back in 2016, 2017, there was a massive Ring of Steel Garda operation, armed Gardaí, a huge visible presence at these funerals because of the threat that was perceived. You won't see anything like that on Friday. There will be a community Garda presence, and I'm sure that there will be plainclothes presence also, but it will be very subtle and discreet. And it's just, I suppose, it's an indicator of where we are. And also, you have to take into account that maybe some of the more senior Kinahan cartel members and those who would be a danger are no longer in this country or are no longer with us or they're locked up.
And even, yeah, so there will be, I'm going to have to be careful what I say here, there will be people who won't be able to attend this.
Yes.
So we can't really go into more about that, but there will be some people who you would fully expect to be at this funeral, but won't be able to go to this.
Mm-hmm. But then, I mean, that's not to say tensions aren't high. This is a very tense moment for the, associates of James Byrne, and they've lost Liam Rowe, and there is an impending trial happening. So there's a lot going on in their world at the moment.
And there's lots that we get to hear about, and they're sort of, we don't print them because we can't prove them, but there's a lot going on around this. Shall we say?
Yes. Right. What's our next topic of discussion?
I want to talk about the report. You did a story about this, about the report into abuse in it's the Spirit and used to be the Holy Ghost order. You're much younger than me. How did you feel? You might fill us in on the story you did, but how did you feel writing that?
Well, it's a highly disturbing scoping report commissioned by the government to look into abuse in religious order schools throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and it's found that there are over 2,000 allegations of abuse, 800 abusers, over half of which are now dead. And in some sense, I wasn't shocked by it. I was disturbed by it, and I read. I will admit, I couldn't really go into the testimony of some of the victims in detail because I found it very harrowing and difficult to read. I had to write about abuse a lot, and it's difficult enough to read. I can't imagine what those people had gone through. But I mean, everyone knows nowadays, with the benefit of hindsight, the amount of abuse that went on in these schools. It's just to see it there in that report, outlined in great detail. It's great to see in one sense, but maybe it's a lot of victims I know feel it's too little, too late. And what can be done now? I mean, a lot of these abusers are now dead. But the only thing I'll point out is that off the back of this scoping inquiry, we had hoped and have now confirmed that there is a major new Garda investigation into these claims. And Garda are taking it quite seriously. And there is an entire national unit dedicated to this, the National Protective Services Bureau, which is going to oversee any investigations that come off the back of this report. And they've asked people to come forward, whether they have before or not, to speak about what happened to them in these religious order schools. I just hope, I suppose a lot of people might feel, as I said, it's too little, too late. I've spoken to a few victims before, even before this report came out, and it's very much, it's all well and good, it's being acknowledged now, but it was silenced and hushed for many decades, and that's the sad part about this.
So the perpetrators will be very, very old people now, and there is you're quite right. So just the way it works, there is the National Protective Services Bureau, which is the sort of national unit, but every division has a protective services unit. So DMR North, DMR South Central, they all have units, and my understanding is they'll be doing the on the ground work, and there has been a significant number. A lot of all the perpetrators are pensioners. I think that's safe to say.
No, that's safe to say. Yeah.
And you'd wonder, by the time there are investigations, there are investigative files, the cases go to the DPP and the DPP charges. I think it's fair to say that some of these suspects will die before justice is meted out to them.
Yes. I think it should also be fair to say that in some of these cases they actually have been investigated and people have been prosecuted. It's not as though none of them ever were investigated. Obviously, you'd be aware of the case of John McLean, rugby coach and teacher in Terenure College, who was thoroughly investigated. There were multiple allegations of sexual abuse against him, and he was convicted, and he's serving a lengthy prison sentence. I actually spoke to a victim of John McLean about this report, and they welcomed it, and they are hoping that it breeds new allegations and that people might come forward about abuse that went on in that school. But from his perspective, I know this man who was locked into an office by John McLean and seriously abused. He is still living with the effects of that to this day. And it's a difficult thing for him. I know every time that he has to speak about it, he goes and speaks to a therapist afterwards because he's still trying. He has PTSD from what happened to him. But he said that this scoping inquiry doesn't go far enough, and that he felt that really the Minister for Education, Norma Foley, that she should be suspending any kind of funding that goes to any of these private colleges like Terenure College, because of, I suppose, he felt there was a cover-up and that there were people who, facilitated the abuse, and that why should the taxpayer be funding these schools to this day? Now, Norma Foley would say, this is something, and she has said, these allegations, these incidents happened many decades ago, and it's in the interest of the government to continue to provide funding to schools now for the students that are going there now. And they would say that it's a changed atmosphere. But clearly that victim, and I'm sure many other victims, still feel like there hasn't been enough justice done and enough of a recognition of this, of what was done to them.
So I'm the same generation as a lot of the victims. Obviously, I'm from the north, but I went to a Christian Brothers primary school, and I went to a school run by priests, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just talking generally, right? I just wonder if we all my generation have a sort of a collective sense of guilt, because did we know? I didn't know. We knew. You would hear jokes, but you hear people joke about it, but it was so widespread. And what I feel guilty about is, as an adult and as a crime reporter, I think you recognize trauma and signs of abuse. And looking back, and just, kids and stuff, there were kids who were clearly challenged or challenging. And I wonder how many of them were externalizing trauma that we didn't know about. Do you know what I'm trying to say? That God knows what they were going through. Like, even I was talking to someone about this the other day, and she said, just the levels of alcoholism or addiction amongst a generation, and how much of that is from abuse. And it was so hidden, but it was also pervasive at the same time. Do you know what I'm trying to say? So it was hiding in plain sight in a way. And I personally feel sort of guilty about what about those kids. If he was acting up, was there something going on that we didn't know about? Because it was just everywhere.
It's hard to imagine it now, but yes, Ireland was a different place back then. And I think the respect and the authority that the church had back then was just a different it was a different scene. And I think when it came to members of the clergy and those people who were in power, they just went unquestioned, really. They were holier than thou, and they were respected on a level that's, it's hard to believe now, but I think when people came forward with allegations, if they did, they wouldn't have been believed, or they would have feared that they would not be believed.
What really gets to me,
we're in a different place.
What really gets to me, it all gets to me, but something I find really, really difficult is there were stories even last week, but we've covered previously before about children who went, say, to their parents, and they're saying they were being abused by a priest or a religious, and they weren't believed. And what would that do? That if you go and talk to your parents and they say, no, that's a holy man. You cannot be saying that about him. And I just, I don't know. I found that very difficult, I have to say. But it happened. I can think of myriad cases where that happened. And there was a fellow on radio talking about this the other day. And I found that very hard to listen to. Just, you go to your parents, they're your parents, and they don't believe you.
Hard to imagine.
Or there's something that they don't believe you, that they can't believe you. They just can't get their heads around it.
Yeah. I think the only thing that maybe stunned me about this report, because as I said, in one way it didn't surprise me, but was just the amount of schools. So there are hundreds of schools listed in this report, and how widespread it was. I mean, it was rampant. It was all over the country. Yeah, you would just hope we're in a different place today, that kind of thing cannot be facilitated. In those religious schools, it was just a different culture. I'm not excusing it, but I didn't live through it. But
I did, and there was never mind the sexual stuff, but there was just a culture of violence in primary schools and secondary schools. I mean, I was talking about this before I came on air. When I was 11, I was out of line in the queue, and in primary school, and a lay teacher grabbed me by the what they're called this, the sideburn, an 11-year-old, and grabbed me down and got me down in the ground, right? And then when I went to big school, the grammar school, I remember a teacher, again, was slightly out of line. He just came up and smacked me in the face. Just open-handed palm, smacking a fellow who was in his 50s, punch, smacking an 11-year-old kid, 12-year-old kid. And that was normal, just accepted.
That was accepted, yeah. You would expect to get a beating.
You would. And I can remember being, getting, when I was 7 or 8, my homework was dirty, and the teacher fucking hammered me with the ruler. 11-year-old kid, or a 7-year-old kid. It was just, so I see all this stuff, people complaining about woke and kids being too cheeky and all. Give me that any day, instead of what we suffered as children and what the poor children who were sexually abused suffered as kids. I will give us mouthy children who know their rights and will give cheek to you. Have that any day rather than what we went through.
Absolutely. I just want to, I actually feel we should probably say this. There is information on the Garda website. If you're a victim of abuse to you and you want to speak to Garda about it, there's an email address there. It's gnpsb_scmu@garda.ie. You can phone the Garda Child Abuse line on 1800 555 222. They say that's a confidential and it's a free service, and you can also call any local Garda station. So at the moment, as I mentioned, there's a brand new national investigation into these allegations of abuse. So you can come forward, even if you've spoken to Gardaí before, or you've never spoken to Gardaí before. There's a brand new inquiry into all of it.
And it has to be said, that the SCMU in that Gmail email address is the Sex Crime Management Unit. So they are part of the NBCI. They're the National Protective Services Bureau, but they're the ones who oversee investigations into clerical abuse. So they are the real experts. And I think with the protective service units around the country, you cannot but help but say how professional they are and how good they are at listening to and talking to victims. So, it's their job, they're experts in it, and there'll be a welcoming ear for anybody who does go to them.
Yeah. Now, I want to mention, because you mentioned it on last week's podcast, obviously the match and the huge Garda presence that was going to be at it. There was anticipation of any potential violence and disturbances. We know now that there was, thankfully, no major violence, but we were talking about this off air. We observed a couple of, I suppose, things of interest to us. Some what would you call it? Rowdiness, unruliness that we want to talk about.
Yeah, before we get into that, I did speak to the guards. He did say a small number of people were arrested. Look, if anybody saw the videos, there was a significant amount of public order unit guards and ordinary regular uniformed Gardaí. But it was explained to me, really, the guidance I got was, look, it was just a typical Saturday evening in Dublin. So it was a handful of people were arrested directly linked to the match and the aftermath of the match. So fair play to everybody involved. But look, one of the things we did see was that there were songs about the late Queen Elizabeth of Britain, and there were Ooh Up the Ra songs. Now, a lot of people, and we know that the English national anthem was booed at this. And I saw a lot of people, in my opinion, slightly losing control of themselves in this. So we've talked about this before. We've spoken about this before. I'm going to say it again. Young kids who did not grow up during the Troubles, and they sing Ooh Ah Up the Ra at Lansdowne Road, as we call it, or the Aviva, or at the Wolfe Tones. I do not think for a second they are singing in support of the IRA's, what they call the armed struggle for 26 years. They're kids acting kids. So, yeah. And there's drink involved, and there's a bit of bollocksology, and there's that whole thing about being in a crowd and you lose control of yourself. And then that's it. I don't think we need a thesis or a sociologist to dig really deep dive down into why young kids are acting like young kids. And even men in their 30s and 40s are pissed. I mean, that's it. And the blood's up.
Yeah, it's a bit sort of, I suppose, drunken behavior in one sense. And people in a crowd will just kind of carry on like children, really. I don't know. I feel funny about these sort of songs. I mean, they don't personally offend me, but I do wonder why grown adults need to get together en masse and sing, things like Lizzie's in a Box or Up the Ra.
So I don't think we need to navel gaze too much in this. It's people, bit of gargle, and they can act up.
I'm going to say no more on that because I don't want to, I'm going to piss somebody off no matter what I say.
But you know what I'm saying?
I do. I hear your point. I want to fit one last topic in just before we wrap this up. Currently working on a story. It should be out by the time this podcast is out. If not, whatever. But look, we always appreciate it when people contact us. We were both contacted by this individual, and I really feel for him in that this is a young man. I'm protecting his identity. Is asked to remain anonymous. He applied for the Garda competition in 2023. Early 2023, and he is still waiting to get into Templemore, and he's very frustrated by that. He says his whole life is on hold as a result of this, and I bring this up obviously because I mean there's a retention crisis on Garda Síochána at the moment, and they're crying out for resources. And we keep hearing that they are fully staffed, but then they're doing everything they can to fill positions, and they're encouraging people to join on Garda Síochána. And yet you have this young man, and I believe about 6 or 7 others that he is aware of, who, for whatever reason, they feel they're being stifled. They've gone through the whole process. They've done the fitness test, done the interviews, and been assessed in every way possible. And here they are after early 2023. We're now into late 2024, and they have no answer other than they've been told that they are still being considered and that there are issues outstanding in regards to assessing whether they're able to get into Templemore. Still awaiting a response from Garda Síochána on this, but I will just say there is a vetting process as well, and Garda are entitled to, and we know they do thoroughly investigate someone's background. They have to make sure you're not involved in criminality. People in your life are not involved in criminality. They have to look at whether you've lived abroad. That delays the process as well. I'm not defending them here. I think from first glance, I think this young man is waiting a very extraordinary amount of time, and I'd love to hear what the reason is as to why someone like him and 6 or 7 others are not already in Templemore.
And bureaucracy is bureaucracy. And I think you're quite right, Paul. There could be any number of reasons. But what struck me about this, last week I said this, that the guards are still a great job. People give out. We facilitate people giving out. And, we want to hear people giving out. But I think there is still a significant cohort of young men and women who are desperate to get into the guards because it's they talk about journalism being a vocation. I think being a guard is a vocation. And I think even watching that On the Beach show on RTE, there was a young female guard from Donegal, I think she's down in Waterford, and she goes, I've known for ages I wanted to be a guard. And I think there is a
Mm.
significant amount of people who are really, really desperate to get into the guards.
Yeah, and this guy, I mean, he told us that he only wants that this is the only career he wants. He wants to be a guard. That's all he wants to do. And yet, I mean, he's already got the worst possible impression, and he's saying this has had a terrible effect on his anxiety, his mental health, and that his life is effectively on hold. I really feel for him in that sense. He feels he's been treated horribly, and he doesn't know where to go next. I do wonder that if it gets to the time where he is offered a place in Templemore, will he even want it anymore? I mean that's how frustrated he sounded when I was speaking to him on the phone. So look, hopefully he gets an answer soon enough.
And the other point about this, just, you know, it's about 170 in what they call an intake. Okay. So
Mm,
it's the last intake was about 170. But, you know, of that, or there is a higher number who are accepted and a smaller number go in. Some people on day one can go, this isn't for me. Or week one or week two can go, no, it's not, this is not
mhm.
what I thought. So there is a natural wastage, but it is somewhat puzzling why he and the others are in this limbo.
Yeah, and especially when you've gone through the trouble of doing that fitness test, which is, I mean, look, some might say it's easy. I don't think it's easy by the looks of it, but I refuse an opportunity to do it. But I mean, that's hard enough. And then you got to go through interviews and whatever else. It's a difficult process, and in the meantime, you're waiting. This guy's waiting 19 months.
Mm.
And then you got to go through the actual college itself, and then you have to be very badly paid for a long period of time. So yeah, I think it's extraordinary that people want to go into the guards still. Thank God people do, because we need people like that
We do.
who really love that job and take it seriously.
And we
So
need people like that who tell us things, which is even more important.
absolutely, yes. Always talk to us. Listen, we'll leave it there. Thanks for
Mm.
listening to us. We'll be back next week where we expect the trial of Liam Byrne to begin. So we'll certainly talk about that if it begins. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.